Hello, my name is Chris Eman. I'm the CEO of the Boys and Girls Clubs of Central New Hampshire, and I just want to welcome you on board as a new staff member of our organization. We have just a great history that goes back over 75 years, and we're going to talk to you a little bit about that because I think it's a great framework for you to think about when you're starting your journey with us.
Nationally, as a Boys and Girls Clubs of America, it started back in the 1860s. This was during the Civil War. So in Hartford, Connecticut, war was still raging. Unfortunately, there were a lot of boys. They called them street urchins at the time. That was kind of the derogatory term that they called these kids. Were just milling around. And to put things into context, there were no social services back then. There really weren't a lot of orphanages. These kids were literally left to their own devices to survive out in the streets. So in that context, you also have to think about history as well, and that there was something called the temperance movement, where there were a group of women that were trying to ban alcohol. And one of the ways that they were trying to do this was get their husbands, essentially the men, out of the saloons so that they weren't going home drunk and doing all kinds of bad things. So what they did is they set up a men's club in downtown Hartford. So these guys could go there. Back then, smoking wasn't viewed as an evil, so they were able to smoke, read their papers, do whatever, and just kind of banter about. It was a nice warm place. They even had a pool table for the guys to shoot pool. Well, inevitably what happened is these boys, these street urchins who didn't have anywhere else to go, started going into the men's club because there was a nice warm fire, so they would kind of hang out there. So it didn't take long for some of the men to say, you know what, we're not going to hang out here anymore. We're going to go back to the saloon where the kids are not going to be able to follow us. And so 3 women got together and they're like, you know what, this is kind of defeating the purpose. So what did they do? Being very entrepreneurial people, they set up a boys' club right across the street from the men's club in Hartford, Connecticut. Set it up with a pool table. Of course, the kids were not allowed to smoke, at least I don't think anyway. And they went so far as to actually hire a university grad named John Collins. He was essentially, you could say, the first executive director of a then boys' club of Hartford. And he set out some basic ideas of what a club ought to be, that it ought to be a safe place, that it ought to be welcoming. Back then they used the term drop-in center because these are street kids. So he thought it was important that we set up a place where these kids could feel free to come and go as they please. He also thought that it ought to be structured, and he also thought that there ought to be hired staff, not just volunteers, that put in some kind of a specialized program for the kids. So you fast forward to Concord, New Hampshire. Another war was raging, this time World War II, so it's the early 1940s. And the police, the Concord police, were noticing that there were a bunch of boys. Many of their fathers were off fighting the war. And back then, which was something new, their mothers were in the factory making the armaments for the war effort. So many of these kids, again, were left to their own devices. They'd go home. Well, some of the boys back then were starting to cause some trouble, throw rocks at the police cars, that kind of thing. So they said, we've got to set up a place for these kids to go. We don't want to send them to jail. They're too young for that. But we need to set up a boys' club, once again. So the Concord Police set up the Concord Police Boys Club. They called it the Addison Martin Boys Club back then. And it wasn't too long before they hired a young man named Jimmy Cirillo, who was the original executive director of the Concord Police Boys Club. And that ran all the way up until the 1960s, where the board got together and said, you know, I think we ought to make this a separate nonprofit of the city. And they also affiliated themselves with Boys Clubs of America. So we became a Boys Club of America kind of affiliate, as you will. So you fast forward even further into the 1980s. We're right here in Concord, New Hampshire. We were the first organization in the entire country back in 1983 to legally change our name and to include girls. So back then we became the Concord Boys and Girls Club. So we've always kind of been on the front of history, and we'd like to say on the right side of history as well. It was a good move, obviously, inviting the girls in. And 7 years before our national organization followed suit. So for us, the 1990s saw a pretty big expansion through what were called Bureau of Justice funding. So we expanded and had a service site up in the Heights, in the old community center, up in the Heights neighborhood of Concord. And then when I came on board in 2000, we set out a strategic vision of expanding into the surrounding towns, and we've been off to the races since then.
So back when I started was June of 2000, so a long time ago. But back then, the organization was different than it is now. We were license exempt, and we ran license exempt at all of our sites, and there were two of them. We served about 250 kids a week or so. So you fast forward to now, we serve about 1,200 kids a week at 25 service sites. The ages are now infants all the way up to the completion of high school. Notable things have kind of happened in the past few years is we first merged with the Lakes Region Boys and Girls Club. And for us, that was a big deal. It expanded our service area way up into Laconia and some of the surrounding towns. Recently, we merged with an early childhood program called Lakes Region Child Care Services. They gave us the expertise and the confidence of being able to implement ECE programming well. But as you join this organization, really, it is an organization that's on the move constantly and always looking for other opportunities to grow. And we hope that as you plan out your career path with us, that you'll think along those lines and want to grow professionally yourselves. But thanks for joining us and listening.